They're bonding. Queen Elizabeth and Meghan Markle disembark the royal train. It's their first official engagement together.
Suddenly the Queen walked in and said, "Meghan, in this family, we don't speak to people like that." And that was a sign of the tensions. Meghan was an actress, probably used to speaking to.
Caused the Queen a lot of anguish in the last years of her life. It's one thing I will never forgive the Sussexes for, is the amount of stress they caused the Queen.
Queen Elizabeth detected narcissistic behavior on the part of Meghan.
Those around her were certain that she saw narcissistic tendencies.
What she's done and what she did to the Queen, I find unforgivable, and I don't trust her, I'm afraid.
We still don't know whether or not they'll keep their, HRH titles. We really don't know where they're going to end up in the long term.
The Duke and Duchess of Sussex did want to move into Windsor Castle, but the Queen said that wasn't going to happen.
Medieval times, dinner and tournament. It was like that. Like, I curtsied as though I was like...
Claims the odds are slim to none that Meghan will ever return to the good graces of the royal family, particularly given the Queen's alleged opinion that Harry shouldn't have married her in the first place.
She really went out of her way to be incredibly warm and welcoming to both her granddaughters-in-law.
But the Sussexes are now very much second-row royals, taking their seats away from senior family members.
I think that they are a liability to the monarchy, and it's so unfair to leave William to have to deal with this chaos, this hurricane that is the Sussexes.
I can't help but think that Meghan Markle will lead herself to ruin, and that she should have listened to the wisdom of the Queen.
She never raised her voice, not once. Not in public, not in any interview, not in any letter that was ever made public. Queen Elizabeth II spent 70 years on the throne by mastering one skill above all others, the ability to reveal nothing. But Hugo Vickers isn't just any royal commentator. He's a historian with direct palace access, a biographer of royal figures, and someone who moved in circles where the real conversations happened. And what he's described, carefully, in fragments, across several interviews, paints a picture that is far more unsettling than the official narrative ever let on. If you want more deep dives like this, make sure to subscribe to Royal Archives, because here's what most people still believe: that the Queen quietly absorbed everything. The Oprah interview, the Netflix series, the memoir, that she processed it all with the kind of grace that defined her reign, forgave privately, and carried on. That's the story the institution wanted told, and for the most part, it worked. Vickers tells a different one. He's described the Queen in her final years as a woman who was, in his words, deeply concerned, not just about Harry and Meghan's departure, but about the specific nature of it. The manner, the timing, the very public way it unfolded. That distinction matters, because there's a significant difference between a grandmother worried about her grandson's happiness and an institution head watching a coordinated unraveling play out in real time. And Vickers understood both roles she was playing. He's spoken about how the Queen processed grief differently from most people. Quietly, internally. She didn't reach out emotionally in obvious ways. She showed care through structure, through inclusion, through the careful allocation of royal duties and titles. So when those structures started breaking down around Harry and Meghan, when the Sandringham Summit happened in January 2020, and the Queen had to personally chair an emergency meeting about her own grandson's future, Vickers noted something telling: the speed of it. The Queen moved fast. Faster than she normally would. That's where things stop making sense for a lot of people, because the public version of events has always framed the Queen as a patient, gentle figure extending grace at every turn, keeping the door open, preserving the relationship. But Vickers, who has studied royal behavior across decades, suggested something the palace would never confirm directly: that the Queen's measured public responses weren't just dignity. They were also strategy. And those are two very different things. There's a moment Vickers referenced that almost no one picked up on at the time. In the weeks following the Oprah interview, the interview where claims were made about a member of the royal family allegedly raising concerns about Archie's skin color,
conversations
There's a
about
conversation with you?
With Harry.
About how dark your baby is going to be?
The Queen's official response was 4 sentences, 43 words. And yet Vickers noted that those 43 words were almost certainly reviewed, re-reviewed, and approved at the highest levels. Every word chosen, every implication considered. He called it essentially a precision instrument disguised as a sympathetic statement. And here's what's raising eyebrows, even now. The statement acknowledged Harry and Meghan's feelings. It said the issues raised would be addressed privately, but it also quietly and very deliberately distanced the institution from the specific claims. Critics at the time pointed out that the phrasing wasn't reconciliation language. It was damage limitation language. Vickers understood the difference. The question is whether the public did. But what Vickers has hinted at goes deeper than any single statement. It goes to the Queen's private feelings, not just about the events themselves, but about what they exposed. Because by 2021, something had shifted. The Queen had survived abdication crises, the death of Diana, multiple constitutional battles. She had managed scandal after scandal with the same implacable composure. This felt different to people in her circle. And Vickers, measured as he always is, chose his words carefully when describing why. He spoke about the Queen's relationship with loyalty, how seriously she took it, how central it was to her understanding of the monarchy, or not as sentiment, but as function. And then he said something that stopped the conversation cold. He suggested that what hurt most, and this is where you have to pay close attention, wasn't the leaving. It was what was said on the way out. That framing changes everything, because if the Queen's primary pain point wasn't that Harry and Meghan left, but what they chose to say publicly while leaving, then the entire story of her so-called forgiveness looks completely different. You're not looking at a grandmother grieving a distance. You're looking at an institution head watching something she'd spent her life protecting get systematically dismantled in front of a global audience. Vickers never used the word betrayal. He didn't have to. The people who knew the Queen, who actually had access, not proximity, consistently describe a woman for whom public duty wasn't a burden. It was her identity. Everything she was bound to the role. And when Harry and Meghan's Oprah interview aired in March 2021, when claims about the institution went out to 17 million viewers in the United States alone, those who observed the Queen in the days that followed said she was, in one account, visibly shaken. Not tearful, not dramatic, just quieter than usual. For a woman of her discipline, that distinction is enormous. Vickers has been careful to note that the Queen never stopped caring about Harry, never closed the door entirely, or at least not formally. But there's a pattern in what he's described that points to something the palace has consistently tried to soften. The Queen's warmth toward people was always conditional on one thing: discretion. She gave loyalty absolutely. She expected it returned in kind. And when it wasn't, historically, with anyone, she didn't rage. She withdrew. That withdrawal, in royal terms, is the most damning response of all. There's another layer here that almost no one is discussing. Vickers, in multiple interviews, has drawn attention to the Queen's deep sense of historical responsibility. Her awareness that she was not just a person, but a symbol, and that symbols, once damaged, are extraordinarily difficult to repair. The concern wasn't just reputational, it was generational. She was thinking about what institution Charles would inherit, what William would eventually lead. And across social media, one question kept surfacing in the months after the Oprah interview. Had the damage already been done? Some royal commentators pointed directly at the timing. Harry and Meghan's most significant public statements didn't come during any crisis. They came during a period of relative stability, when the institution was attempting to modernize quietly, carefully, without spectacle. That context matters, because it meant the disruption wasn't reactive, it was chosen. Vickers, for his part, never accused anyone of intent, But he did say, and this is the part that stays with you, and that the Queen understood the difference between someone who left the institution and someone who left while burning the path behind them. She had seen both. She knew which one this was. And here's where the story gets genuinely complicated. Because nothing about the Queen's public behavior in her final 2 years suggested bitterness. She met with Harry privately. She appeared at the Jubilee composed and warm in her limited capacity. She gave every public signal of a woman at peace with her family. But Vickers, who studies performance and protocol as a professional discipline, has made a point that cuts through all of it. He said, carefully but clearly, that the Queen's public composure was never a reliable guide to her private feelings, that she had spent her entire life ensuring those two things never aligned publicly. So what did she actually feel? That's the question Vickers keeps circling, and never quite answering directly. But the shape of what he describes tells its own story. A woman who valued loyalty above sentiment, who processed pain through structure rather than expression, who, in her final years, found herself navigating something she had no constitutional precedent for, a senior royal systematically using their proximity to the crown to fuel a global media operation aimed at the institution itself. Some observers have pointed out, and the numbers support this, that the Queen's final public appearances reflected something the palace never verbalized. She looked tired in a way that went beyond age. Royal correspondents who covered her for decades noted a change, not in her discipline, but in her energy. Whether that was purely physical is something no one can say definitively. But Vickers, in one of his more revealing moments, said something understated that landed harder than anything dramatic could have. He said the Queen was a woman who believed deeply that what you did in public reflected what you actually believed, and that she found it increasingly difficult in her final years to understand how people raised within the institution could come to see it so differently. He didn't name names. He didn't have to. Because there's one final thread here that pulls everything else tight. In the months before she died, the Queen made a series of small but deliberate decisions about who she was seen with publicly, who she gave her time to, what that time communicated without a word being spoken. And in every one of those appearances, the same absence was visible. The full picture of what the Queen told Hugo Vickers, and what she chose not to say, may never be completely known. But what Vickers has offered piece by piece across years of careful commentary is something the official record will never provide. A window into a woman who never stopped performing dignity, even as what she was protecting quietly broke around her. Make sure you're subscribed to Royal Archives, because the story of what the Queen knew, and when she knew it, is far from over.